Hello, my name is Father Peter John Cameron. I'm a Dominican priest, and it is a joy to be with all of you at this Marian conference. And the title of my talk is Joy in the Time of Pandemic. Many of us these days are praying in the sentiments of the psalmist. Turn back, O Lord, how long? Show pity to your servants. Give us joy for the days of our affliction. At the same time, we know that St. Paul instructs us in the letter to the Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. And we might counter to St. Paul, how do we do that, St. Paul? It's so hard. For we live in a time of the planet-wide novel coronavirus pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of people have gotten sick or have died from COVID-19. And so many more live in mortal fear of becoming infected. We are not the first people to have to contend with such a pestilence. In the 3rd century AD, a pandemic ravaged the world. Saint Cyprian, who was the Bishop of Carthage, wrote, "Many of us are dying from plague and pestilence." Several years later, Dionysius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote in an Easter message, "Out of the blue came this disease, a thing more frightful than any disaster whatever." So the question is it possible to be joyful amidst a pandemic? The letter of James answers this question directly. Brothers and sisters, the letter tells us, count it pure joy when you are involved in every sort of trial. St. Peter encourages us in a similar vein in his first letter. Do not be surprised, beloved, that a trial by fire is occurring in your midst. It is a test for you, but it should not catch you off guard. Rejoice instead in the measure that you share Christ's sufferings. When his glory is revealed, you will rejoice exultantly. So how do we have joy in a time of pandemic? It all depends on how we live our love, our faith, and our hope. So, where does joy come from? What is the cause of joy? Who said cheesecake? So you're close, but the real answer is love. What is the cause of joy? St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, love, charity is the cause of joy. Joy follows from love. Joy is an effect of charity. It's why joy is one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit who is the love uniting the Father and the Son. Joy follows from love, especially when we are loved by God. So Pope Benedict XVI wrote, "The source of Christian joy is the certainty of being loved by God, by the one who holds the entire universe in his hands and loves each one of us with a passionate and faithful love, a love greater than our infidelities and sins, a love which forgives." Where does joy come from, he asks? From the assurance that I am wanted, I am accepted, I am loved. Only faith gives me the conviction it is good that I exist. It is good to be a human being, even in hard times. We must remember the words of St. Paul in the letter to the Romans. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Trial or distress or persecution or hunger or nakedness or danger or the sword? For I am certain that neither death nor life nor angels nor principalities, neither the present nor the future nor powers, neither height nor depth nor any other creature will be able to separate us from the love of God that comes to us in Christ Jesus our Lord. And we have been given that love. One of my favorite parables is the parable of the talents, which is a parable that sometimes gets misrepresented or misinterpreted. Because here's what's at the heart of that parable. We have the master, the landowner, the owner of a great estate, who decides one day to hand over to three of the lowest servants in his employ, they're really slaves, just an untellable amount of money, a huge fortune, talents. One gets 5, one gets 2, another gets 1. Well, 1 talent is worth 16 years worth of wages. So it's an immense amount of money. And when he hands the money over to them, he doesn't give them any instructions in the Gospel of Matthew. This is chapter 24. He just goes away for 2 weeks on a journey. So basically he leaves now these super wealthy servants to their own devices, and they can do with the money what they will. But for some reason, they don't opt to take the money and run away or buy themselves out of slavery or just to go on vacation. Rather, by using their own resources, they go and they invest the money. And then once they've made some interest, they return to the master with that interest in order to hand it back to them. And the question is, well, why? Why do they opt to work this way with the money? Why do they come back to the place of their own slavery? And we get a sense in the way that the master responds to them, because he's really not interested in the money. He has so much money, and he doesn't seem like a person who has a hard time making a lot more. Otherwise, he wouldn't be handing it over to the lowest slaves in his employ. But what does the master say to them when they return so faithfully? He says to them, "Come and share your master's joy." In other words, he's so delighted with the way that they have responded to this offer of love which he has shown them, which is what the giving of the money is all about, the handing over of the talents is all about. And so it's an opportunity, it's a kind of a challenge to them to throw off their slavery and to accept this invitation to receive a new status as sons, to become his children. That's why they can share his joy, because in the master they have met a love that assures them that it is good that they exist. They don't exist as slaves. They exist as his own children, sharing the joy of the Father in the way that only a daughter and a son can share their parents' joy. We know joy in a time of pandemic by ourselves, constantly returning to that moment in our own life when Jesus looked at us the way that master looked at these servants. The moment when Jesus looked at us the way that no one else has ever looked at us before. And when he invited us into an embrace of love that goes beyond all of our failings and all of our weaknesses. A look of love that loves us not because we're good, but because he is. The master doesn't choose these servants because of some super goodness that they have or some ability that they have. He chooses them, he sets them apart, and he endows them with his greatest fortune because he's good. And they have the courage to believe that and to accept that love in their own life. So we keep that love and joy alive also by sharing that love with other people. And this is where we find so much of our joy. A great Catholic philosopher by the name of Joseph Pieper says, "One who loves nothing and no one cannot rejoice." And I know that in the moments in my life that are joyless, and when the darkness is encroaching and I really have a sense that joy is almost a fiction, and I have the dread that joy is not going to return to me. Do you know what the cause is? What's behind it all? It's the fact that I'm too self-absorbed. I'm too focused on myself, and I'm not loving others actively, and I'm not engaged in the love of God for me. I'm not making it a priority. I'm not reverencing it and responding to it in my own life. And to that extent, then, that I've edged out or elbowed out love from my life, of course I can't rejoice. Because one who loves nothing and no one cannot rejoice. So the pandemic then is also a challenge to us. And it's a challenge for us to redouble our efforts at loving God and loving others. As I say, we're not the first ones to have to deal with a pandemic. And when the ancient world was overwhelmed by plague and pestilence, and this happened more often than I want to be aware of, there was something truly conspicuous and really outstanding about the way that Christian people responded. So there's an awesome book that I just reread because of what we're going through right now in the world. The book is called The Rise of Christianity. It's written by a historian and a sociologist, Rodney Stark, who is intrigued by how it is that Christianity grew in the world when really everything conspired about Christianity to keep it from becoming the largest faith, the largest religion on the planet. And he talks about the role that Christians played during the time of plague. And he imagines the thought process of a pagan at the outbreak of a plague. Here's what he writes. He says, "So here we are in a city stinking of death. All around us, our family and friends are dropping. We can never be sure if or when we will fall sick too. In the midst of such appalling circumstances, humans are driven to ask why. Why is this happening? Why them and not me? Will we all die? Why does the world exist anyway? What is going to happen next? What can we do?" And if we are pagans, we probably already know that our priests profess ignorance. They do not know why the gods have sent such misery, or if, in fact, the gods are involved or even care. Worse yet, many of our priests have fled the city, as have the highest civil authorities and the wealthiest families, which adds to the disorder and suffering. But then Rodney Stark goes on to describe the response of the Christians of the time. He says, Christian values of love and charity had, from the beginning, been translated into norms of social service and community solidarity. When disasters struck, the Christians were better able to cope, and this resulted in substantially higher rates of survival, which is one of the reasons why the Christian faith grew, precisely because of pandemics and the way that Christians responded to pandemics. The Roman Emperor Julian, who's better known infamously as Julian the Apostate, who ruled from 361 to 363, commented on how the local Christians responded to plague in his own time. He says, the impious Galileans, that's how he refers to Christians, the impious Galileans, support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us. So not only did the Roman Empire not do anything to help poor people who were suffering from the plague, but at the same time, they were astonished at the heroic generosity and charity of Christians reaching out not only to fellow Christians, but to anyone who was suffering from sickness, including the pagan people of Rome. He's so struck by that charity amidst the pandemic. Saint Cyprian, who I already quoted, again, the Bishop of Carthage, writing a century earlier than Julian, this is in 251 AD, commends his own people during their time of plague. He says, how suitable, how necessary it is that this plague and pestilence, which seems horrible and deadly, searches out the justice of each and every one and examines the minds of the human race, whether the well care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love their kinsmen as they should, whether masters show compassion for their ailing slaves, whether physicians do not desert the afflicted. Although this mortality has contributed nothing else, It has especially accomplished this for Christians and servants of God, that we have begun gladly to seek martyrdom while we are learning not to fear death. That's the joy that the Christians of the time of Cyprian experienced in their flesh and through their flesh. By caring for the sick among them, they knew the joy of sharing in the glory, analogously, of the martyrs. 10 years later, as his own city was being besieged with plague, Dionysius, the bishop of Alexandria, made a similar observation. He wrote, "Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. Death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom. Other people would not think this is a time for festival, but far from being a time of distress, listen to this, it is a time of unimaginable joy. The heathen behaved in the very opposite way. At the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treated unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they might, they found it difficult to escape. So we can ask ourselves, well, how were the Christians of that era able to do it? Maybe they took to heart the words of Psalm 91, which they prayed. He who abides in the shelter of the Most High and abides in the shade of the Almighty says to the Lord, my refuge, my stronghold, my God, in whom I trust. He will free you from the destructive plague. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the plague that prowls in the darkness. Upon you no evil shall fall, no plague approach your tent. For you has he commanded his angels to keep you in all your ways. This is a psalm that we too need to pray with a loving heart. What about joy and faith? Well, from a certain perspective, we should not be surprised in the least at what is happening presently in the world, because our Lord foretold it. In chapter 24 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "There will be famine and pestilence and earthquakes in many places. These are the early stages of the birth pangs. They will hand you over to torture and kill you. Indeed, you will be hated by all nations on my account. Many will falter then, betraying and hating one another. False prophets will rise in great numbers to mislead many. Because of the increase of evil, the love of most will grow cold. The man who holds out to the end, however, is the one who will see salvation." So we can ask, is it possible to remain joyful before such a dire prediction? And the answer is yes. Why? Because Christians possess the one crucial, indispensable thing needed to possess genuine joy. And what is that? Pope Benedict XVI tells us it is having a definitive answer to death. That is what is indispensable in order to be able to be joyful. And we have that answer thanks to the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The joy resulting from Christ's resurrection is so all-encompassing that it actually made extinct one form of drama. There's a theory that the resurrection of Jesus caused the genre of drama known as tragedy to become obsolete. Well, how can that be? Well, you remember in school reading Greek tragedies like Medea or Antigone or Oedipus Rex. And so what's distinctive about a tragedy is this, that you have two heroes and they both represent something that is good. So it's two good things coming into conflict. This is the difference between tragedy and melodrama. In melodrama, you have a good guy, and then you also have a bad guy. He usually has the long mustache and the black cape. But in tragedy, no, you have two good people, two people that represent good positions, but the whole drama hinges on the fact that only one of those positions can prevail. And the outcome for the one who doesn't prevail is a terrible one. It's everlasting darkness and death. It's being pushed into the abyss of oblivion. The theory about the resurrection nullifying tragedy is put forward by one philosopher by the name of George Steiner in an excellent book entitled, appropriately, The Death of Tragedy. And here's how the argument goes. He says, what is central to Christianity is what? It's that it offers people an assurance of final certitude and repose in God. It leads the soul toward justice and resurrection. This is at the very heart of everything that we believe in following Jesus Christ. However, in order to have real tragedy, tragedy can only occur where a tormented soul believes and is living in dread of the fact that there's only so much time to receive God's forgiveness. But for the Christian, forgiveness is always possible. We can never run out of time while we're alive. Being on a threshold to the eternal, as we are, the death of a Christian hero can be an occasion for sorrow, certainly, but not for tragedy, because death is not the end. It's a beginning, and it's the beginning of eternal life, not being pitched into oblivion. Thus, because of Christ's resurrection, the only possible ending in any drama from now on is a happy ending, which is the technical definition, actually, of a comedy. Which is why there has never been in literature a specifically Christian mode of tragic drama. For Christianity is an anti-tragic vision of the world. The Christian vision of the human being has no choice but to lead to a denial of tragedy. For any theology that offers a redemptive heaven is necessarily fatal to tragedy, because there's nothing to hold over the head of the person who is in the wrong, since ultimately there is no way to punish a tragic hero. And so George Steiner says, in the dark light of Christ's suffering, original sin is shown to have been a joyous error, what we call the felix culpa. Through it, humanity shall be restored to a condition far more exalted than was Adam's innocence. Which means that in the face of death, no matter how horrific, Christians don't experience dread. They experience joy. The joy that Christians are called to embrace and to communicate in a time of pandemic is the joy of certainty. Now, here's what we have to remember about certainty. It's not something that is summoned forth psychologically. This is not something that we work up using our psychological powers. Rather, certainty comes from being in another's presence. Think about it. Who would you say is the most certain person on the planet? And do you know what my answer would be? It would be a tiny baby in the arms of his mother. Why? because hearing the mother's heartbeat and becoming accustomed to the unique way that the mother holds and cradles her little baby, that baby knows that he is in the most secure, the safest place that the world has to offer. So if that mother were even going to walk through fire, the baby wouldn't care, as long as he was in the baby and mother's arms. The more we put ourselves into the presence of one who loves us and secures us and fills our life with that kind of confidence and sense of safety, the more our certainty grows. Certainty comes from the fact that, like that child in the mother's arms, we are chosen too. The more we reflect on how chosen we are, the more our certainty grows. And also, certainty comes from the mercy that constantly embraces us again and again and again. Listen to what Jehoshaphat says in the second book of Chronicles. In your hand is power and might, and no one can withstand you. When evil comes upon us, the sword of judgment or pestilence, we will stand before this house and before you, for your name is in this, and we will cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. That's certainty. That is a perfect prayer of certainty. 2 Chronicles 20:6 and 9. Therefore, at this moment in our life, if we want to have joy in the midst of the pandemic through the exercise of our faith, we need to do everything in our power to put ourselves in God's presence and in the presence of godly people, and especially to put ourselves in God's presence through his Eucharistic presence in adoration. Also, we have to live the memory of being chosen and meditate on the words of Jesus to us before he dies. It's not you who chose me, it's I who chose you. And thirdly, we have to surrender again and again to the mercy that embraces us. So even if we don't have serious sins on our conscience, grave sins that require going to confession, go to confession anyway. Because by the embrace of mercy that we receive through that sacrament, our certainty will only increase and grow and become something rock solid and permanent in our life. And there's a very important, crucial reason for Christians to be driven by this kind of joy, and it's this: because joy is the only real enemy to Satan. Our joy is what he can't stand. Do you remember that passage in C.S. Lewis's awesome book, The Screwtape Letters? So Screwtape, who is the senior devil, is reprimanding an apprentice who is entrusted to him, the devil Wormwood, because Wormwood has allowed his human prey, who he's tempting, to fall in love. And to fall in love with what hell considers the most threatening kind of woman. Screwtape actually goes on to describe her. He says, I have looked up this girl's dossier, and I am horrified at what I find. Not only a Christian, but such a Christian, a vile, sneaking, simpering, demure, monosyllabic, mouse-like, watery, insignificant, virginal bread-and-butter miss. The little brute, she makes me vomit. She stinks and scalds through the very pages of the dossier. It drives me mad, the way the world has worsened. We'd have had her to the arena in the old days. That's what her sort is made for. Not that she'd do much good there either. A two-faced little cheat, I know the sort, who looks as if she'd faint at the sight of blood and then dies with a smile. A cheat in every way, looks as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, and yet has a satirical wit. The sort of creature who'd find me funny. That's what drives Satan away and drives Satan crazy. That kind of joyfulness, no matter what we suffer. And lastly, we have to think about hope, meditate on the role of hope for our joy, because perhaps most of all, the possibility of having joy in a time of pandemic depends in large part on how we live the virtue of hope. Hope is a reaching out for a future good with the confidence that we need to have in the dominion of divine providence, because God is in charge. And hope is living with the assurance that no matter what happens, the things that happen one by one are just the way they're supposed to be, because God's providence is overseeing and controlling the unfolding of every moment, to which we simply have to be faithful moment by moment. Hope is the interior condition of being driven to an ultimate something that goes beyond anything that we can attain for ourselves. It's being driven to true life. Hope is asking that the good thing that happened to me today will happen to me again tomorrow, no matter how ominous or foreboding the future may appear. And there is an intrinsic connection between joy and hope, because as we already said, what is the cause of joy? And it is the experience of being loved. And the same is so of hope. Pope Benedict says, to have hope means to know that we are definitively loved, and that whatever happens to us, we are awaited by love. Hope, like joy, then comes from the awareness that there is someone who loves me with this everlasting love, who calls me into being every instant, having pity on my nothingness. It doesn't matter how bedraggled or ragged we might be in our spiritual state. It doesn't matter just how beat up our soul is, or how much we feel undone by our own nothingness. The love that has come to love us, which is the definitive love, is the love that has pity on that nothingness. It's not repulsed by it. It has pity on it. And when God has pity, he always acts in a creative way. It's not a sentimental feeling. It's not a sentiment at all. It's an occasion for God to once again do what he does best, which is to create and to recreate out of the very nothingness of ourself, just as he created out of the world, out of the chaos of the nothingness that existed before creation. So he's not going to leave me to flounder in my nothingness, and my hope has to be focused on that fact, that my nothingness is not my undoing, but it is the very claim that I have on the mercy of God to act on my behalf. I love what St. Thomas Aquinas says about this. He says, the nearer a being stands to God, the further away it is from nothingness. So, do you feel overwhelmed by nothingness because of the disarray that has befallen you because of the pandemic? And does that nothingness threaten really to overwhelm and to sabotage your whole life? So what St. Thomas says to us is what we need to take to heart. To take our focus off of the nothingness, because it's like poverty. It's always going to be there. But rather to actively use our hope to stand closer to God. Because the closer we get to God, the farther away we become from every form of nothingness, but especially the nothingness that threatens us and seduces us and wants to undo us from within. I remember reading a story that was told by the author Studs Terkel about a woman lawyer that he was aware of, who was an incredibly formidable person. And one of her clients was a streetwalker, a prostitute, and she had to go to court. And so during her court appearance, she was terrified, and the lawyer was standing there with her. The young defendant's hands were trembling with fear, and it's a fear that only became worse and worse because the judge was so opposed to this young woman because of her profession, and the judge let her know it by calling her any number of scathing names. But when that happened, the lawyer put her arm around the young woman, and with that, the woman instantly straightened up. And Studs Terkel writes, that's where hope comes from just standing up. Jesus wants to put his arm around us at this moment in the pandemic, no matter how much it besieges us, and no matter how invincible it might seem to us at times. We can give in to a defeatist and fatalistic mentality. But if we do what needs to be done, simply to feel that arm around us, we can stand up and hope can become renewed and reignited in us and set us on a path of true and lasting certainty. St. Thomas Aquinas says, we have hope for one simple reason, because we belong to God. And when we are constantly mindful of that belonging, which is what Holy Communion is all about, which is why Jesus says at the Last Supper, do this in memory of me, so that from that memory, we will remember the belonging that we have to God, and we will have hope because of that recollection. Pope Benedict XVI, in his beautiful encyclical on hope called Saved in Hope, says, a distinguishing mark of Christians is the fact that they have a future, that they know that their life will not end in emptiness. Only when the future is certain as a positive reality does it become possible to live the present as well. But so often as we go through these dismal days, we think that our life is going to end in emptiness. And that's why God continually floods our life in new and surprising and sometimes subtle ways with signs of the positive reality of the future. It's why he keeps putting in front of us credible promises of life that will not end in emptiness. Because joy, when you think of it, is simply a response of the human heart to any credible promise of life. I mean, think about it. What are some of the happiest places on the planet? And of course, you can say, well, the family gathered around the Christmas tree, and church, and any place where Christians are gathering and sharing their faith. Of course, it's going to be a joyful, joyful place. But do you know one place that is incredibly joyful, but it's the most secular place that you can probably think of? And that's an airport. Why? Because at airports you will always find families congregated waiting at the end of security for their loved one to come into view. And the moment that the loved one comes into view, their heart leaps. And why does their heart leap? Because the presence of their loved one coming down the ramp is a credible promise of life. They leap for joy, anticipating the happy life that they're soon going to share when they get home together. And Jesus constantly fills our life with these kinds of credible promises of life. And you yourself are one of those, which is why it's so important that we have to live our hope. Because when people see that hope and the joy that is attendant to it because of joy and hope being so intrinsically connected, then they will catch that wonderful contagion of hopefulness, of joyfulness. And the pestilence of the pandemic will fade in comparison, because they will have an answer to their emptiness. And it's not something vague or abstract, but it's someone with a face. It's you who gives them the assurance that it is worth taking the risk to believe in Jesus Christ the way that you do. because that joy can't be faked, right? How often do you meet a joyful person? It's so rare, and I always say, when you meet a joyful person, there are basically only three options. One is that they're on some sort of prescription medication, or the other option is that they're escaped from an insane asylum, or the option for the Christian, that they've met Jesus Christ and it has made all the difference. So that no matter what we have to face in life, no matter what crosses or afflictions or sorrows we face, it is joy that prevails. Even in life's most sorrowful moments. Because let's face it, there is a lot of sorrow in life. Life is full of sadness. And we might get up in arms and say, well, I mean, is it possible for joy and sadness to exist together? Is it possible to be sad but also joyful at the same time? Because it seems like the two would cancel each other out, that they would be mutually exclusive. But the answer is no, they don't cancel each other out. Yes, our joy can be mingled with sadness. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us something that we can really count on during these days of pandemic. He says, the human desire for joy is inherently stronger than the fear of sadness. The human desire for joy is inherently stronger than the fear of sadness, which means what? A human being, by design, is hardwired for joy. No matter what you throw at it, or throw in its path, we always are going to go after joy, certain that there's a joy out there that exists that can bring joyfulness to our condition. I remember the day my mom died. It was a Sunday during the season of Easter, and she had been in hospice for some days, so we knew the end was coming. And at 3 o'clock on a Sunday in Easter, so at the time of Divine Mercy, I went into her room. My mom had been unresponsive for so many days, but her eyes were wide open, and I knew that the end was close. And so I absolved her from her sins, and I gave her the apostolic pardon, and I anointed my mother, and I gave her Holy Communion of Viaticum. And with that, my sister Nancy came and spoke to her and said, Mom, it's okay. You can go to God. Jesus is waiting for you. We'll be all right. Go to Jesus. And with that, at the stroke of 3 p.m., my mother died. Now let me tell you something. Was I sorrowful? Was I sad? Yes, of course I was. But I was also exuberantly joyful. Why? Because I knew my mom's suffering was over, that my mom, whose very name was Dolores, so she was named after Our Lady of Sorrows, died at the moment of her son's death on the cross, and was so united with the Blessed Virgin Mary in her own, as the mother of sorrows at the cross of her son. So yes, sorrow and sadness can commingle. A great mystical philosopher, Simone Weil, who loved the Catholic faith, said, suffering is violence, joy is gentleness, but joy is stronger. And I agree with her. No matter how strong the violence of the pandemic might be in our life, the gentleness of joy is stronger. We simply have to cede to it, surrender ourselves to it. As St. Paul says in the letter to the Colossians, by the might of God's glory, you will be endowed with the strength needed to stand fast, even to endure joyfully whatever may come. And I believe him. Because joy, by definition, is the gladness, it's the satisfaction of possessing something that leads to our genuine happiness. And whatever brings us closer to the cross of Jesus Christ and unites us to that cross is leading us to our genuine happiness. No matter how painful our crucifixion, our being nailed with Christ to the cross may be, it doesn't outdistance the joy that we experience, because we know we're bringing it to our ultimate happiness and beatitude with God. This is why Bishop Barron will say, when he describes a painting that depicts the crucified Christ in just such utter agony, as a picture of the supremely happy man. Because despite all the pains that our Christ is going through, what wins out is the joy of knowing that he possesses what is needed to get back in the Father's arms. Because joy is the satisfaction of possessing something that leads to our genuine happiness. And Jesus has all that he needs as he is hanging on the cross. This is the kind of hope that St. Paul professes in the second letter to the Corinthians. He says, I'm content with weakness, with mistreatment, with distress, with persecutions and difficulties for the sake of Christ. And I'm sure St. Paul would add there, even with the agony of pandemics. For when I am powerless, it is then that I am strong. Or in the beautiful words of the poet Gertrude von Lefort, a Catholic writer, I have gone down to the waters of despair, but they are not deeper than my own heart. Why? Because my heart is hardwired for joy. It is hardwired for hope. In fact, there's only one disposition that cannot coexist with joy. And do you know what that is? It's fear. Why do we end up being manipulated by fear? Because we're no longer anchored by the promise that Jesus Christ gives us and is for us. And as long as we're afraid, we're not looking for love. We're looking for something else. What are we looking for? When we're menaced by fear, what we're looking for is power. And just think about the people in your life who let fear be the dominating factor in their life. All of their energy and all of the force of their affection is put to the side because they have to find power. So there's only one choice in life for us, especially at this time of pandemic, and it's this. Will I live surrendered to fear, or will I hand myself over to trust in Jesus Christ and in his Blessed Mother and in his church? If our hope is flagging, and so often it's perfectly understandable that our hope is, all we need to do is turn to the Blessed Virgin Mary, because she is the cause of our joy. It is said that Dostoevsky would sit for hours in front of an image of the Madonna. And why did he do that? Well, as he said, in order not to despair of humanity. And so, if you're a little despairing today, all you have to do is get an image of the Blessed Mother and just sit before it until hope revives, and with that will come a new influx of joy. Guaranteed. Our Lady will not let you down. She's the cause of joy. So we want to live that hope, and we want to live that hope with the certainty that's expressed in this awesome oath that I came across a few years ago through the Catholic evangelist and apologist Patrick Madrid. It's called the Oath of the Fellowship of the Unashamed. And let me end by making this oath for you and with you. I am part of the fellowship of the unashamed. The die has been cast, the decision has been made, I've stepped over the line. I won't look back, let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed, my present makes sense, and my future is in God's hands. I am finished and done with low living, sight walking, small planning, the bare minimum, smooth knees, colorless dreams, tamed visions, mundane talking, frivolous living, selfish giving, and dwarfed goals. I no longer need preeminence, prosperity, position, promotions, applause, or popularity. I don't have to be right, first, the best, recognized, praised, regarded, or rewarded. I now live by faith. I lean on Christ's presence. I love with patience, live by prayer, and labor with the power of God's grace. My face is set, my gait is fast, my goal is heaven. My road is narrow, my way is rough, my companions are few, my guide is reliable, and my mission is clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of adversity, negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up, shut up, let up, or slow up until I have stayed up, stored up, prayed up, paid up, and spoken up for the cause of Christ. I am a disciple of Jesus. I must go till he comes, give until I drop, speak out until all know, and work until he stops me. And when he returns for his own, he will have no difficulty recognizing me. My banner is clear. I am part of the fellowship of the unashamed. God bless you.